Chippewa City, where I was born and grew up, was once a thriving village with natives outnumbering white settlers. Between 100 and 200 people lived all along the shore of Lake Superior, east of the town of Grand Marais. My grandfather, James Morrison Sr., was one of the elders and founders of St. Francis Xavier Church, a Catholic church built in 1895 on a rise above the lake. He usually sat in a gray pulpit chair he had built. The chair was always located to the left of the church door, where he greeted people and officiated as the bell ringer.
George was very fond of his mother. He had this to say about her in the beginning. She was very sweet and loving and kind, more loving right along the line than my father. Why, I don't know. Maybe it was shyness. He liked children only as infants. When they grew up, he became more distant. She was a strong mother. She learned the hard way about cooking or household work, about marriage and the customs of marriage. Starting out simple, she learned by hit and miss, cooking the basics like rice and potatoes and macaroni. She got fish from a commercial fisherman in Chippewa City named Drew Yard, who smoked and salted fish. When his nets came in, she went down and got a dozen herring. That became part of our diet. Anything special was store-bought. We always thought store-bought bread was a big deal. I sort of was like that too, growing up in South Carolina years ago. My parents would actually say, "We want you to behave and be like a white person." Maybe they meant they wanted us to be educated. Maybe they wanted us to be clean. Maybe they wanted us to behave properly. In other words, not to be too Indian. But how can one change his color? I don't think they meant it that harshly. I don't think they were ashamed of being Indian, but they always looked up to the white man. My family knew their situation. The only connection they had with white people, not many but a few, were school officials or welfare officials, the doctor who was white, and administrators who came to our house. My family accepted white people as white people, but they were more open toward their own kind. Certainly makes sense. George had a period of working for the CCC when he was 17, and his brother, Bernard, I think it was, had a job at Mount Maud. This is what he had to say about Mount Maud. One of the few paintings that remains was bought by the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. It's called Mount Maud. I painted it outside with an easel in the old so-called romantic way of doing things, plein air depiction. I was home for the summer, staying with my brother Bernard at his forestry tower on Mount Maud. That was near what used to be Mineral Center, a little community on top of the hill above Grand Portage, 4 or 5 miles up. Bernard was married by then with children, and they lived in a cabin at the foot of the tower. You had to walk up a steep sloping hill to the base of the tower. He climbed the tower to do his job, watching for fires. I must have been very glad to make $50 selling Mount Maud to the Art Institute. It was purchased from the local art purchase fund out of the Institute's annual local artists exhibition. All the students, George was now a student at the Art Institute school, were interested in trying to show as much as they could. I was fortunate to get in that one. I probably painted it in an afternoon, setting up my easel on the ground and adjusting it so I could stand at it. I used a palette and an oil paint box, standard equipment for art students. I worked by observation, looking at the subject matter in front of me, the mountains, the grasses, the trees and winding road, and lots of goldenrod along the road. Then I depicted it, modifying to a certain degree. You always arrange the composition as you go along. So I'm skipping ahead, and I'm going to ask Paul Bush to come and read. This is 1954. The chapter is called Dreams of Destination, Earth Songs.
Thank you, Margot. I met Jackson Pollock once at the Cedar Bar in Greenwich Village through Kobe. Pollock was attracted to the dog and began to ask questions. He may have had a poodle himself. I didn't quite know who he was, but he introduced himself. "I'm Jack Pollock." By then he was well known as one of the so-called big boys who'd started abstract expressionism. But he still liked to come around and be sociable, sit in a booth at the Cedar Bar. He and Willem de Kooning and Franz Klein, they all came to the Cedar Bar. The bar wasn't a showy place with artwork on the walls. It was just a common bar. Dark wooden booths. Bland would be a good word for it. Though they were the big boys, gestural painters at the height of their notoriety, the camaraderie was such they didn't walk around and act superior. They were friendly to everyone. All, in their way, were hard drinkers, one of the characteristics of the group. I also sometimes let go of space entirely. In these paintings, there is no reference to a horizon line or anything. It's open space. A lot of my work emerged out of scribbles, part of the automatic drawing technique that came to us by way of the French, the Dadaists. They, in turn, were influenced by the associative thinking deriving from psychoanalysis. Frottage, when you rub charcoal or pencil over paper placed on a surface with a pattern, was also a technique used by the Dadaists.
I went through a period of using thick paint, starting from the late 50s all through the 60s. This gave more immediacy to the painting. Putting the paint on without thinning it with oil, or using acrylic paint without any water added. Putting it thick on the brush and then on the canvas with broad strokes, showing the thickness and the movement of the pigment. Some of the paints were right out of the tube, like cobalt blue and burnt sienna. Some were mixed, like lavender and light blue, but otherwise, the colors were raw. This was my version of gestural painting, which was the other abstract expressionists like Pollock and de Kooning were doing. This was typical of things going on in painting at the time, gestural immediacy. Movement of the paint became an integral part of the idea of painting. There might be a suggestion of subject matter, as in a landscape that I called pier because it looked structural, but the phenomenon of paint was what the painting was really about. Rather than getting sentimentally involved with the subject, the artist was more conscious of the paint itself, and that became the painting.
In 1958, the town of Grand Marais honored me with a dinner and a special exhibit of my paintings. My mother came up from Duluth. She was a supporter of my work. She didn't understand much about it or the process of learning or being curious like artists are, but she supported it. I saved all the clippings from that show. At dinner, I spoke briefly and thanked my friends, the Anderts and the Downeys. Quote, "They made me forget I was from the wrong side of the tracks," I was quoted as saying in the Cook County News-Herald. Mrs. Downey gave me courage to go out and make something of myself. The endless space of abstract expressionist paintings, where the painting seems to go in all directions, struck some people as explosive and destructive. Destructive of the objective in painting, not showing a literal subject matter. But there was the cool, hard-edged, more geometric kind of abstraction, too. These various forms of abstraction were all going on at the same time. And I think it's interesting to think about what George does later with his huge wood collages, which are really quite hard-edged in lots of ways. Okay, now in the second half of the book, Hazel, who of course was an artist, is an artist, a fine artist in her own right, joined us to talk about their life together. So in this section, there are passages that are sometimes Hazel and sometimes George. In this case, this is Hazel. And it's the first time George is taking her to Duluth. They've already been married. They met in Dayton. He was teaching at the Art Institute in Dayton. Okay, Hazel is speaking. "Before we left for Duluth, I went to say goodbye to my mother. 'You better take a pair of boots along,' she said. 'I understand it gets very cold in Minnesota.' I borrowed a pair of her boots, the old zip-up kind with fleece lining. It was a good thing I did because the heater in the Dodge didn't work and the front vents were rusted open. We arrived in Duluth around midnight. I was frozen. George's mother and his brother Roger and sister Josie were waiting up for us. I was so numb I could hardly walk. After we were introduced, I asked George's mother if I could lie down. Always gracious to me, she showed me into the front bedroom. There was a curtain across the doorway. Right outside was the phone. As I was sitting on the bed taking off my boots, the telephone rang. "Oh, yes, George is here," I heard her say. "Oh, yes, brought his new wife with him. Oh, yes, married another white woman." And then George piped up and said, "That's a funny story about my mother." And Hazel continued, "When I heard that, I knew it was really significant, but I didn't understand how much." We both had a lot to learn. Expectations, communication styles, all were different. Later, some women in Grand Portage would help educate me about the differences. George would say to me, "That's Indian." The women would laugh and help me see what was cultural and what was Morrison. But for the moment, I was on my own. The women in George's family were always very loving and welcoming to me, but it took a long time for us all to be easy together.
This is George speaking. In 1970, I gave up my tenure-track position as associate professor at the Rhode Island School of Design. It was the first big job I had had, and it had been good. Providence was and still is a good art town with the best art school in America, but it's easy to get lost in academia. I wanted to come back to the Indian connection, to Minnesota and my family. I felt an inner need to come back, not realizing the consequences of what I was doing. I felt the need to put certain Indian values into my work. There was a job opening at the University of Minnesota in a new program in American Indian Studies. I applied. It turned out to be a dual appointment with the Studio Arts Department and the American Indian Studies Department. The Indian Studies course was a lecture course that meant once a week, like a seminar. Hazel continues. When the letter came accepting George, I wasn't that keen on the move. Both of us had good jobs. I'd been teaching 6 years at the Lincoln School, and George had a full-time permanent job at the Rhode Island School of Design. But I knew that he had a rivalry in the department, and he really wanted to go back to Minnesota. The main thing for me was that Joe, who had been living with us, had been so sick with leukemia. He had a good clinic in Providence. Finally, he had started to get better. Was this the time to move him?
There were only so many walls, he would say, wherever we moved. When I would claim a wall, he would declare, "Hazel wants equal wall space." George and I are a generation apart. In his generation, women didn't compete with their husbands for careers or for wall space. He thought that when two artists married, one would inevitably do something secondary. I sometimes think that the difference in our ages had a bigger impact on our relationships than the difference in our culture. And this is George. We put a lot of money and work into that church. We covered it with wood siding to get away from the church look and converted the church, interesting use of words, converted the church hall in the basement into my studio and workshop. Hazel had a studio constructed upstairs, and we added redwood decks and a stairway going to the second floor.
He named his paintings in a kind of odd way. He would throw dice. He would use tarot cards. He would open the dictionary and point to a word. So I'm going to say the title, and you give what George said about it.
Okay.
Okay. Ragged Breath, The Rise of Wendigo.
Broad passages of color as thick as icing.
Ingot Compression.
A thick layer of oil on top of acrylic.
Beyond the Mist.
Short strokes of paint over alternating cold or warm layers of color for a pointillist effect.
Alpenglow.
Rough layers of paint to give a shimmering, bumpy effect.
Spring Interval.
Light creeping above the horizon, a yellow streak to suggest the moment when you look at the edge of the horizon and see a band of light.